Hi, my name is Mike Kays. I'm a graduate of Rhode Island College, class of 2025. I got a BFA in ceramics. And we are in my show Impulse Control. The impetus for the show started off with an idea of what I call chains. And the chain essentially became little bricks that get connected by found materials. I live in Pawtucket, and in Pawtucket there's massive amounts of like old mill buildings. A lot of them or some of them are destroyed. And I oftentimes walk through these buildings. I love to find used materials, old metal, rusted metal. You'll see a lot of the material here for like the nails, for instance, are all found in areas like that. And it was in those areas where I started to see different kinds of bricks. And I thought it would be fascinating to be able to, at some point, maybe collect these bricks and connect them with found materials into larger sculptures. But I think like the logistics of doing all that became a bit overwhelming. And so I started doing it in ceramic on a much smaller scale. And I thought it just became like this process that I found to be really kind of thrilling. Like you'd find different materials and found color, which is really important to me. I think a lot about color and how that mixes. So oftentimes, like I have a massive collection of threading material, everything from wire to rope to anything from like fencing materials. I use a paper rope in one with burnt ends. And everything gets combined usually in color and in size with the different bricks that you see all around you. Sometimes it's really serendipitous. A lot of times when you use like found data cable or wires, there are smaller wires inside. And it's always fun to see what colors are in there that add a little bit of detail to the pieces you see here. My other fascination is with glazes. I probably spend about half my time in the ceramic room at RIC working on glazes. And what that basically consists of is just a lot of reading. So there's a lot of like basic ceramic glaze books that we use down there. And we find a lot of base recipes, anything from glossy to matte to experimental glazes that you'll see in this room. And it's just a love I have to be curious about how chemistry mixes to form these glass surfaces on the pieces you see around you. So for instance, a lot of the smaller chains that you see on the wall here, they're all named after the different glazes that are used on the piece itself. And all of the pieces, when I talk about color too, there's a certain color harmony. Anything from like complementary to cross-complementary to maybe even staying in the range of like neon mixed with matte glazes. So yeah. I've made art all my life. I've always liked to draw. I go through different phases. So there was like a photography phase that is still even lasts today, like film photography. When I was younger in New Jersey, there was a lot of graffiti, and it was something I became involved in. A lot of my friends that I met were through graffiti, and I thought it was just fascinating. Kind of like the same interest that you see here with like finding found material. A lot of graffiti had to do with like finding abandoned spots, finding freight trains and different things that were, you know, just kind of super fascinating to explore, and also just to be able to apply paint to a surface and create something new in a space that's oftentimes like forgotten or abandoned. And that was a large chunk of my life early on. I traveled around quite a bit to do that. Like I said, the majority of my friend network comes through that, through especially hip hop and graffiti. And there was a point, I guess, in my 30s where I kind of stopped doing a lot. I was still drawing, but I was doing a lot less art making in general. Life kind of just takes you down certain roads sometimes, and you know, sometimes it's not great. You know, I'm definitely someone who in the past has struggled with a lot of anxiety and depression. And I think that before I started going back to school, I was kind of like coming out of a different era of that kind of just like very downtrodden. And I felt like I had a new lease on life. And so that's when I decided to go back to school. So I'm 43 now. At the time that I went back to school, I was like 35 or 36, and so this is my 8th year in school. At first, I just slow rolled it, and you know, when you go back to school at that age too, and you study art, you know, there's definitely like some people would say it's not the most practical, which is a lot of the feedback that I got early on from some family and friends, like, are you sure this is what you want to do? And I'm really glad that I didn't listen to any of that feedback, because I feel like, number one, I can't help it. Like, I just want to make. To me, it's just like, that is what I want to do with my life, and to be the boss of your own making, and to be able to create a cohesive idea in a show, or just to, you know, continue studying glazes. All those things became really, really important to me as things evolved, to the point where this is what I do every day, and I couldn't be more grateful. It's a struggle. I haven't necessarily found my world of like any kind of gallery, or I do shows consistently, which is good, and it's a slow building process, and so hopefully that's something that builds over time. One beautiful thing about Rick, we have an incredible ceramic department. We have so much that we actually can't use it, either because we don't make enough work, you know, or it's just like, there's so many avenues to pursue in ceramics, like raku, different reduction gas kilns. We have various electric kilns. We have a wood kiln. And so it's not something you use all the time, but when you do, it's there for you. One of the limitations that I think is kind of interesting is process, right? Like, I think that learning how to work with clay and learning all of the nuances and how much failure, well, what's considered failure. After a while, you learn that you can't really consider it failure, it's more data, you know, what not to do, especially with things like glaze making, because the majority of the glazes you make, especially early on, are just like either unusable, but it's all data points into understanding why different chemicals do what they do, how clay works, how different clays work even within like the substrate of a glaze. Also, it's timing. Ceramics is a lot of timing. So on any given day, any step of the process, from drying to wedging to there's always something to do in the I think that's what keeps me interested, actually. It's always kind of fresh every time I walk in, and you never really know what you're going to get. You can use the same glazes over and over, and you can do the same process, and things will just come out different depending on the weather, you know, how things dry in a studio. Like right now, because the AC is pumped so high, a lot of things tend to dry in like a very strange way, and you kind of have to be prepared for that. Those challenges there. I can talk about the work that's actually right behind me here. So these, I call them plaques, ceramic plaques. I made the first one back in like 2019. Nothing on here, all of these are from when I was here at Rick. But I think they just became a quick sketches for me initially, like thinking of different processes and using different molds and different kinds of clays. And so essentially they became textiles. And as that process of making these plaques evolved, they turned into different things. Like, for instance, they turned into maybe little daily diary entries. So you'll see a piece here, I call it Asheville, and I had a friend who, during the floods in Asheville, or in the North Carolina, Blacksburg, Virginia area, they had a pretty bad flood there. And so I created a topographical map, and I used glass inside of the topographical map. And so, yeah, you'll see different elements that become like, so I was really interested in the Anasazi Indians, and particularly just like the history of pottery in the American Southwest. I always, like, to me, that's always just been really fascinating to be able to take native materials. Also, the meaning of what pottery was, like, just in human history, how pottery became something of, especially for hunter-gatherers, to be able to store crops, to prevent things from decaying. And so I've always been just like fascinated by where we come from within the world of ceramic and American Indians. So you'll see things like the Anasazis in particular. There's two pieces here, one high and one low. And the Anasazis would sometimes put eyes on a lot of their cave drawings or wall drawings, the petroglyphs, what they're called. And so it was always just like really interesting to me that they would choose these like very menacing eyes. So I started to use that kind of idea of like the work being a reflection of an ideal that, you know, we kind of don't know what that was, but it still has a similar effect as what I'm imagining that some humans, when they saw it, as if it were a warning or if it was just something much more spiritual or deeper for them. So those pieces, they speak to me. I use some security envelope. So like I've always been really fascinated by this idea of security envelope, how like these patterns on the inside of envelopes are supposed to obscure the ability for someone who's maybe snooping to be able to see what's inside the envelope. And so for instance here, this is like a mimic of a security envelope. Some of them just become tests for glazes that I think are really interesting. Making glazes is kind of like mining at times. It's almost as if like you kind of have to work for it. Like if you see an impetus of something like a glaze possibly working, maybe the chemistry has to be adjusted just a little bit to make it work. And so sometimes some of the pieces you see here become just that, like the finished product of working through the chemistry of a glaze. There's a couple of pieces I'm thinking about as we speak that I'd probably, if you find it interesting. There's one on the floor here, it's called Matter. And this piece was the first one made in this room. And what makes this kind of interesting, it became my semester project, and it probably spans over the course of 4 months. And there are a lot of things when I made this that I would never do again. So for instance, I believe there are 43 separate glazes, all made from the same base glaze, but using different both stains and chemicals to make the gradation of color. I wanted a perfect gradation. And in doing so, there were a lot of pitfalls. The chemistry wasn't working for the kinds of colorants that I was trying to use, and so oftentimes they would come out a lot of times white or just not how I envisioned it being. So I had to adjust, but I really enjoyed the base glaze, and the base glaze is something that almost any glaze that goes on the surface of a ceramic object starts with a base glaze, and then you add different materials to kind of create the effect. It's kind of a loose way of putting it, but it creates the effect that hopefully is desirable in the end. And so this piece came, you know, there were times when it just was not working. And I think I finally got it to a point in the end where I'm happy with that. Yeah, there's another piece along the corner of the room, and it's called Block Party. And I love this piece for me in particular because it's the complete antithesis to how much effort this piece took. And you know, there was a lot of like, you think of like, so there's over 400 pieces in Matter, and you multiply each step. You know, if it takes me a minute just to clean the edges of a piece, to like soften the edges with a sponge or do something, everything, multiply that by 400, and it just takes time. It's a very labor-intensive thing to do. The piece Block Party against the wall became the complete antithesis to that. I was working with a friend of mine in ceramics down here, and they were kind of helping me. We use all different kinds of clays. We got really experimental with the glazes, and it became something very loose and fun. And so it's nice to see like these two pieces work with one another. They're very similar in how they're laid out, but they also have like a very different feel altogether. Also being able to use experimental glazes in chemistry. We use things like foam glazes, which look like lava. We use different kinds of, there's an interesting glaze called the Quan glaze, which I believe is from like 800 AD in China, was one of the first times it was used, and it looks as if it's like glass that's been crackled. So it's just fascinating to be able to find a recipe, even something that's so old, and then, you know, it's probably the same way in some sense how it was made originally. I remember when I was a kid, I went to a therapist, and the therapist said, they had mentioned something about my impulse control, and it was just always it was always a statement that kind of just rung, just something that kind of always stayed in my mind. But what I think is interesting, or actually like contradictory to impulse control, is that ceramics kind of lacks impulse a lot of times. But the way that I approach it, I feel, is kind of impulsive even within the constraints that you're given. Things require certain temperatures. They have to be very precise. Glazes need to fit the clay body that they're on. They have to be very precise. And so there is a certain level of like playing, but there's also a certain set of values that you have to kind of follow for things to work. And yeah, so it's kind of a contradiction. Also, one thing I envisioned with this show originally was starting off very clean and simple. So there's 9 pieces in here right now. And one thing that I wanted, before this piece was up, there was another piece in its place, and there were 9 pieces in here. I had needed to take that piece down, and so I put this in its place, and I kind of left it because it was the next stage of how I envisioned the show happening, which was to just fill it up with all the various tests and pieces and kind of just lose the control that it started off with. So, yeah. I really appreciate the time that I had here. I've been to 6 different schools, maybe 7, I don't know, we'll do 6. But I went to 6 different schools. Most of them were community colleges, and I have a very soft spot for community college. I find that it really set me up for success, I think, and especially just to be able to kind of play around without paying too much money to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. And once I found ceramic, that was it. And the school that I was at previously, there just became some issue. I was studying sculpture, and it became this thing where sculpture did not include ceramic. And I had always envisioned myself being able to I wanted to make sculptural ceramic. And so there were kind of some limitations, and that was another school in Providence here. And then I found Rick for my junior and senior year of school. And when I came here, it was incredible. First off, how it's a very small community, but it's a very potent community. And all of the instructors and professors here, I feel like, were very approachable, but also very hands-off. Like, they just allowed you to kind of do, especially in ceramic, it was just like, think of something to do, make it. And it became like, and that's what I really enjoyed, especially about Craig Bachman, his instruction. He was always super supportive of just being able to play and make something, and he always provided the framework to be able to do so. And so, yeah, I took printmaking, for instance, with Stephen Fisher. He just retired, and I still hold that as probably one of the most incredible experiences that I had here at Rick, just to be able to see how someone on that level makes work, but also thinks about the work and the references that they're using. And also, in his case in particular, Stephen Fisher, he has this incredible ability to just be able to treat each student in the way that they deserve to be treated, depending on how they learn and depending on the interests that they have. And that's always a lesson that I'll take with me, not to be too constricting with for someone who has such a refined ability, he was still able to tailor his advice and his ideas to the student in front of you. And so there were just some very potent lessons that I learned here. We don't live in a vacuum, right? And so one of the really important things for me was is to be able to say thank you to a lot of the people that helped me out. In particular, there's Crandon. Crandon is the tech of the building here. And he was super instrumental in just helping be a guiding voice, putting things together. My friend Tito Sapa, she is an incredible designer and maker in her own right, and so she would oftentimes help just think problems through. My partner Robin Francis, she always had my back 100%. My parents, Craig Bachman, my instructor, Victoria, you've been supportive since the beginning of this as well. And so, yeah, it's incredible. The response has been unlike anything I would have expected, and I think that I think that it kind of, one thing that really surprises me about, you know, being able to do this, I've never really done anything on this scale, but just the ability to connect with people who you do not know. I think that's oftentimes, it's kind of hard in our society now to do that and to be able to have meaningful conversations. And yet I feel like I've had so many just, you know, based on someone being able to relate to the work that's present. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.